Welcome into the Big Bets on Campus podcast. I'm your host, Mike Calabrese, and I'm joined by the man they call Duck. It's Joshua Nunn, my new co-pilot for the Group of Five Deep Dive this season. Today, we're getting into a little bit of everything, so strap in for a smorgasbord of G5 football. Stuckey and Colin have already set the appetizer table, breaking down a lot of the major storylines in college football in terms of the offseason, player movement, coaching carousel. They even talked about some of their best bets, so please go back in your podcast feed, listening to part 1 and part 2 of their offseason special. Now it's time for us to do the same with the G5. So, Duck, welcome to the show. How excited are you for college football being back here for the 2025 season?
Mike, I am so thrilled to be back at Action Network for another year behind the wheel. We've been chomping at the bit to break down some of the key happenings in the Group of Five, and we'll soon be getting into conference previews, futures and regular season wins, the award markets, all leading up to week 0 where it all comes together. We've been prepping for this since early spring, and it's all we've thought about for months. So there's definitely some exciting changes in the Group of Five to discuss tonight. For the G5 landscape and beyond. We're so anxious to just get started talking about all the different movement in the college football landscape. There are teams moving up, teams changing conferences, the NIL, roster turnover. There is so much happening that we need to dive into.
Now, if this is your first time tuning into the Group of Five Deep Dive, you're going to want to know that you're in good hands, and we are obsessives when it comes to Group of Five football. We live and breathe this stuff. And in my humble opinion, we passed the do they know ball test. And I'll just give you a quick run through of my qualifications because there's nothing specific that I could point to. I didn't play D1 college. I certainly wasn't in the NFL. I didn't work for a franchise. I didn't work for a major program. But I still think that when you add it all together and you cobble together my qualifications, you're going to feel as though I'm the right shepherd to walk you through the G5 experience. I was a student assistant at Mizzou under Gary Pinkel my freshman year all the way back in 2005, which was an incredible experience for me because not only did I get to work with the defensive backs on that Missouri Tiger team, but they were making a transition from kind of an archaic run-centric offense to a spread option offense that was pioneered by a coach that always seemed to get the best of Pinkel and his staff, and that was Urban Meyer, both at Bowling Green and at Utah. So for that reason, I got to be in the film room, cutting it up, looking at everything that they were doing, at least with the Utes and some of the Falcon tape as well. So I got to just pour myself into all of the work that goes on behind the scenes with the X's and O's, getting up on the whiteboard, designing plays. I ended up transferring to Loyola, Maryland, that famously does not have a football team, but I continued to work with that football program as a student assistant under head coach Gordy Combs. So I love college football. It was just not the right path for me to continue on the coaching side. But I've always found a way to be a part of it. And you can go back, I've worked for USA Today, MSN, The Score, Saturday Down South, all before working for Action Network, covering college football in particular from the smallest schools to the SEC for The Score. I wrote a book last year that you can still find over at Amazon, Legendary Bowl. It basically breaks down the best teams since 1980, puts them in a 68-team March Madness-style tournament, and simulates that out using the video game. And that's it's just part and parcel of who I am as a person. College football means so much to me, and I'm always looking, how can I be more involved in it? I've also run a college fantasy football league for 24 years. This does not make me a qualified expert in a single item line on my resume, but by being in the weeds, by starting a fantasy league in 2001, Joey Harrington was the first draft pick, scoring everything by hand, pen and paper, using newspaper box scores. I've been living the late night Hawaii, the Pac-12 after dark, every element of college football, whether it's the very top of the sport to the very bottom. And we're going to get into that throughout the season this year. We've certainly done it in years past. We were here first with the Diego Pavia experience. Bailey Zappi saying him coming from Houston Baptist. They're not even called Houston Baptist anymore. They're Houston Christian now. But basically trying to mine and unearth these gems. That is our job, to get you as fired up as possible about college football, particularly the G5, and to try to give you a little bit of that angle and that advantage on the casual, on the general public to say, we're here first. We're putting our stake in the sand and saying that these teams are going to be the teams we should be backing. These are the teams we should be fading throughout the season. So that's my quick CV. I just want to throw that out there. I realized recently that I don't think I've ever listed it all out for our audience. But Duck, I'd love to hear what got you into the gambling space in particular and why you're going to be the perfect co-pilot for me this season on the G5 Deep Dive.
Well, college football has been my favorite thing to do since I was 8 years old. I played football growing up, and I actually played at the FCS level at the University of South Dakota for a couple of seasons. and I am now entering my 18th year of betting on college football, specific to the Group of Five and the FCS leagues, along with early entry into the regular season win market, where I've had routine success over the past 10 seasons. During my time with all that, I've built up a significant following on all the major gambling forums for anything pertaining to college football, against the spread wagering, preparation, analysis, providing sound and objective reasoning behind my selections, and just really diving into the weeds, like you had mentioned, in this sort of betting space. In order to have success and get to the window on these plays, there are no shortcuts. There's not an easy path. And really the way to do it is to have no stone unturned and to really provide a lot of the sound mathematics and the analytics, which I know and understand. And now I'm in my second full season as a contributor for Action Network, after bringing the FCS element to our college football production last season and diving in, writing up single game breakdowns for our group. So it was nice to become an integral part of that operation, and thrilled to be taking on the position here with BBOC.
All right, enough about us. The main purpose for today's episode, as I mentioned from the top, is to get you excited about G5 football. That means we're going to hit all the coaching changes, the players that are set for start turns this fall, and the storylines that are already shaping the narrative. But first off, welcome to the party, Delaware and Missouri State. It is great to have you. The Blue Hens come in with 6 national titles in tow, albeit 5 at the D2 level. They won 1 in 2003 at the FCS, at that time the D1 AA level. Rich Gannon played for them. Joe Flacco. Newark, Delaware has always been a college football town. They care about their Blue Hens. Tubby Raymond, coached there for 36 years. If you don't know the name, his Delaware wing tee offense was legendary. It lives on today with what Navy's doing in Annapolis. It helped them pump up their offense to over 31 points per game last fall. And for a bit of college lore, at least in my opinion, the original Hot Bagels in Newark, the best bacon, egg, and cheese that you can find on a college campus here in these United States of America. Now, Missouri State, on the other side, they competed at the D1 AA level, FCS level, since 1982, and experienced recent success under Bobby Petrino. Yes, that Bobby Petrino, who guided them to back-to-back playoff appearances in 2020 and 2021. Ryan Beard has them well positioned to make this transition and be competitive right away in a wide open Conference USA. We're going to talk about that soon in terms of our conference preview season. But after they finished inside the top 20 in scoring and total offense at the FCS level last year, I think there's going to be a name or two that pops up in this episode, and Duck is excited, I'm sure, to be able to have that FCS connection right away. Missouri State also, back when they were Southwest, Missouri State gave us the alumni John Goodman. So they're already doing, plenty in terms of Americana, adding to the culture. I think they're going to be a great addition to Conference USA. For the rest of the G5, some light realignment in addition to Delaware and Missouri State. Their move to Conference USA. You also have UMass returning to the MAC. And then there are 8 G5 programs this year in their swan song, their last season in their respective conferences. I'll just run through this real quick. You got all the states are leaving the Mountain West and headed for the Pac-12, whatever number they end up landing on. That means Boise, Colorado, Fresno, San Diego, Texas State, and Utah State. Now, Texas State moving from the Sun Belt to the Pac-12, Utah State also in the Mountain West, and then Northern Illinois saying farewell to the MAC. This one breaks my heart. They are so they're so entwined in what MACtion has been over the years. They've had so many great moments, including last fall, beating the national runner-up in Notre Dame. They're headed for the Mountain West as well, and UTEP is cutting ship with Conference USA and headed to the Mountain West. So those 8 teams, one last ride in their respective conferences this year. Now, with all this being said, you got the conferences that are in motion. You got the G5 rosters that are experiencing just extreme turnover in the portal era. Teams that I guess you could argue that they're weathering the storm, or they're embracing what you're framing as this theater mentality. What do you mean by that, Duck?
Well, it's getting harder and harder at the G5 level to compete with the Power 4 schools with the transfer portal rules and the influx of NIL money. It's really just provided and provoked the Power 4's ability to handpick talent at this level. And so the gap is widening. G5 schools can no longer compete. So many programs are really just resorting to kind of embracing what they're going to be. They're recruiting underrated high school prospects, some JUCO guys, and then also dipping into the Division II and FCS ranks for talented players there. And they're really just pitching them on the idea of show up, ball out for a year or two, and then move on to something else and go on to greener pastures and bigger and better things. And so coaches are having to now resort to all of these different recruiting mediums, including re-recruiting their own roster year in and year out. And so this approach is just a way to retain or attract talent and get people to the program in hopes that they can show up, show out, and cash a paycheck with a P4 school after a year or two. So there are a lot of programs that are embracing that mentality. We'll see if it pays off for them.
There's also the downstream impact, which is, can these coaching staffs put together strategies, season long and then week to week, that these players can grasp without a ton of continuity, without a ton of reps? I think that is something that we're going to get into when we talk about coaching changes. Some of these coaches, they just have systems that are a little bit more player friendly. And I think that's more important at the G5 level than maybe it is at the P4 level, although there's still all kinds of roster chaos there with the big boys as well. We're going to hit 4 segments in today's show, so strap in here. We got the G5 playoff bid draft, the G5 coaching changes that we've circled, the most impactful scheme changes from year to year. So there's some squads that played a certain brand of football last year, and they may be moving in an absolute opposite direction. And it's good to know, those implications early on, certainly before you lock in your first bets of the season. And then we're going to close out with the top G5 quarterbacks in our opinion. Let's start with the G5 playoff draft. I know this is your first go around here with the show, Josh. Here's how it's going to work. Whoever drafts the team that wins that G5 auto bid, they're going to have a prize pack. We're talking hat, bowl shirt, maybe a lanyard, maybe something golf related, all going to the winner, paid for by the loser. If we both strike out, and this is an important caveat, because you would think drafting 10 of these teams, one of us is going to get it. Multiple times it has gone to our producer, Matt Mitchell. So we need to make sure that we laser in. We don't let anyone slip through the cracks here. You're new to this process. I'm going to allow you to have the very first pick in the 2025 draft. Who are you going with? Is it a repeat performer from last year?
Well, given the nature of the draft and the teams that are likely to compete for a potential college football playoff bid, my first selection is going to be Boise State. They do have the shortest odds available in the betting menu to reach the college football playoff. We won't get into a tremendously deep dive on these teams, as we'll save that for the conference previews, but I do like that they're short up on the offensive line. And while they do have to replace Ashton Genty, they are pretty excited about what they have in their running back room. Maddox Madsen returns at quarterback. The secondary appears to be improved for Boise State. They get to host UNLV, Colorado State, and Fresno State, and should be locked in conference play. I'd say 10-2 at worst for Boise State this season. So my first selection will be Boise State.
It's hard to go against them. I understand a generational talent is out the door, but their running back room is far from empty. Sire Gaines, they've been raving about this guy, Breezy Dunbar. They have options there. And Maddox Madsen popped at times last year, and I understand every defensive coordinator was focused on stopping Genty, so it's going to be different in terms of the sophistication he sees downfield, in terms of coverages and zone blitzes, etc. But I still think this had to be the pick. So good job on your part by not making a mistake reaching at number 1. Now, I have back-to-back picks before we go back and forth for the rest of this draft. I'm going to go with a bit of a surprise here. I wrote it up in the Action Network app. I'm going to go UTSA as the number 2 pick overall. Everyone is back on their offense. In this era of G5 football, this does not exist anywhere else in the entire country. All 11 starters, including JT Clark, who's coming back off multiple knee injuries and hoping to get those lower body injuries in check so that he can be a contributor. Everything is looking good offensively, and I have Owen McCown, a guy I'm going to talk about later in this episode. They were hot at the end of last year. They finished 5-2 down the stretch. They nearly upset Army, who won the AAC. And they have an opportunity to be really dynamic offensively. Now, Jess Lepp, their defensive coordinator, he's someone who's got to do basically a rehab job on this defense because they only bring back one consistent contributor. But he's done this multiple times. They've lost the AAC Defensive Player of the Year in back-to-back seasons, and he was able to cobble together a defense last year. My question is, can they throw a scare into A&M? Because they don't even need to beat Texas A&M in the opener. We saw it with Boise's scare they threw into the Ducks. The national perception was basically playing them to a tie or being competitive late in the game, that was enough to say that they belong on the national stage. And I think A&M, this is a team that's played with their food in recent years against lesser teams. You saw it last year against Bowling Green, against Arkansas, against Auburn. These are some of the games that they lost outright, but they certainly let these teams hang around. For all the talent that A&M has, I think it's an interesting spot to catch them right away. You know that UTSA, with all of these kids who played in the state of Texas that got overlooked by A&M with their deep pockets, they're going to get premium effort in this spot. All right, third overall pick, my back-to-back pick here. This is a team, Candle is a head coach I've not been all that complimentary of over the years. I think he's done less with more in terms of talent in the MAC, but he's got so much back on this roster, namely his quarterback. But in addition to Tucker Gleason, you got Rudolph, you got Trainum. That gives them pop offensively to be really explosive in the passing game, on the ground, potentially a really good secondary. And they have Kentucky in the opener. I'm just going to say this. After, that 2 or 3 year run where Stoops was really cooking, they opened 4-0, I think it was 2 years ago. Since then, he's basically been a 500 coach. Financially, Kentucky's in this tough spot where it's like, do we fire him and pay the buyout, or do we just use the money to pay the players? It's strange. 5 years ago, I think he would already been out, but he could be a lame duck coaching this season. I don't necessarily see it in terms of a huge offensive upgrade for the Wildcats, but from a name brand perspective, this Toledo team did this exact same thing on the road last year. They beat an underwhelming SEC team in Mississippi State. They beat the brakes off of them. So in terms of, can we do this, the mental hurdle you have to get there, they already believe in themselves in this spot. So I think the Rockets are a really interesting play. I understand that when you look at the American and you look at, to a lesser degree, the Mountain West, you could have 2 losses potentially and get the bid, where everybody else, it's either 1 loss or undefeated to be in the conversation. If they get this win over Kentucky, I think Toledo's in a really interesting spot. That's why I'm picking them third overall.
2 teams gone that were high on my board, so those are some really good selections by you, Mike. I like it. I'm going to take Memphis. I think that Memphis is poised for a really solid year, even in spite of what they lose offensively. I think that when you look at Memphis, they have the most NIL money in the group of 5 with their FedEx deal. The schedule is one that calls for them to likely be able to run through many of the opponents that they play in AAC play. They host a lot of their tougher foes in AAC play, to include South Florida, Tulane, and Navy, all at home. They have a chance to get a real signature win in what I think is possibly one of the ugliest spots of the season, when Arkansas has to travel to Memphis in a real sandwich game for the Razorbacks. It's one of those seasons for Memphis where I think that if the transfer hits are A+ hits, and if we get solid quarterback play from Nevada transfer Brendan Lewis, this bunch could be really pesky and could have themselves in the running to get back to the AAC championship game, where they may just be playing UTSA.
A little gamesmanship here, because there's 3 teams I could go with here for my third overall pick here in the draft. I just have to figure out who you would potentially select with your next pick. I can't pass up the Sluka-Chesney reunion. I'm just going to go with the Dukes. I know that their defense is beyond green at this point, and they have early roadies to Louisville, to Liberty. I still think if they give Louisville a good fight in a loss and beat Liberty, they're going to be in a really great position if they can run the table in the Sun Belt to be an interesting option here. Sluka certainly is a perfect quarterback to run this offense, because what Chesney wants to do is use that deep backfield and also play the numbers game. When you want to run your quarterback 10 to 15 times a game, you get that extra blocker in front. And you saw what he meant to UNLV's offense last year. He certainly has those limitations as a downfield passer, but they're not going to ask him to do it. They know how to handle this guy and to put the defense in conflict with all the read and option elements that they have. So I'm going to go JMU and hope that all these new faces, in terms of their defense, come up. I mean, they did pretty well in the portal, kind of backfilling some of the spots. I think the biggest issue is what they lost on the line. And really, that's been kind of their calling card when it was Signetti and then Chesney, being able to have those terrors off the edge, certainly once they get into conference play. I'm hoping that some of these guys step up, but I'm going to go JMU here.
Yeah, and they're not sure if Alonzo Barnett is going to be ready to go, but if he is ready to go, just an added bonus for the Dukes. And they may or may not be my darling pick to win the Sun Belt Conference this season, so I think that's another great selection there. Well, let's circle that Week 4 matchup with JMU and Liberty. That's the team I'll take next. So Liberty, I believe, is really head and shoulders above their competition in Conference USA this season. They'll be favored in likely 11 games. Their schedule, even when you factor the non-conference, it's Charmin soft. I like the additions that Liberty spent a little NIL money in the portal and went out and got some players, namely Ethan Basco from Coastal Carolina. I think will fit that offensive system for Jamie Chadwell just fine. And I think if you are looking at Liberty, they're probably a team with their strength of schedule and with the lack of big opponent names on that slate. They're probably going to have to go 11-1 or 12-0, but I think it's a bunch that's certainly capable of doing that. I like the way that the schedule lines up in Conference USA play. So my next selection, Liberty.
Yeah, Basco is, I mean, first of all, he was recruited by Jamie Chadwell at Coastal. And he was somebody who was super dynamic in his high school career. He has, I believe, still the Virginia high school record, 10 touchdowns in a single game. And you've seen him pop at times. A couple years ago against Old Dominion, he ran for 170 yards. I think that's what they were missing a little bit. Caden Salter wanted to do more from the pocket, and they just weren't as efficient. You saw it in that Kennesaw letdown where they couldn't string together those third down conversions. They lost a bit of that energy. It's an offense that wears people down. They need to have those 8, 9, 10 play drives. When you have a running quarterback who's willing and you can have him in the option game and the read game, I think you can really hurt teams. So the only drawback, obviously, is this is the weakest schedule in the FBS. Multiple metrics have them 136 out of 136 teams. So they got to go 13-0. And that was my only reservation with this. And I think in addition to that, if you're up against a one-loss Boise or a one-loss AAC champ, you not only have to run the table, but you have to be convincing doing it. And you really only have one marquee game before the Conference USA title game, and that is against JMU. You got to go ahead and beat JMU by, double digits at the very least, and then hope that Western Kentucky somehow finds a way. I mean, not to spoil the Conference USA preview, but assuming that their quarterback transfer and everything they're doing offensively, they pop and they win 9 or 10 games. And then you have a nice little bump there as that 13th data point. But that was my only reservation with Liberty. It was the same from last year. Hey, Jamie Chadwell's gone undefeated twice since 2020 in the regular season with Coastal and with Liberty, so we've seen him do it before. I like the pick there. That was kind of where I was hemming and hawing. Is it too early to take Liberty? Clearly, it wasn't too early because you were ready to pounce with the very next pick. All right, now I'm back in a bit of a pickle here. Do I go with Tulane? Do I go with Miami of Ohio? Tulane, clearly in terms of reloading, and they needed to replace a lot of key performers from last year, namely their starting quarterback, and Mekhi Hughes, who's off to the riches in the Pacific Northwest. I'm not there with Simonza at quarterback. I don't know necessarily if he's going to be the quarterback for the entire season. I just, in terms of his schedule, he popped at times last year, but it was a downy soft schedule. It's a big step up in terms of their non-conference this year and also just the slog of the AAC. So I'm going to go Miami of Ohio. DeQuan Finn back in the conference after spending a year down at Baylor. They really gave him the weapons in this wide receiver room. There's so many Power 4 kids that transferred in. I just need one or two of them to pop. They got a quality secondary. They have a really good coach. And they have 2 winnable games in terms of potential upsets. If you want to play Wisconsin this year with an offensive scheme change, going from that dairy raid spread to the reliably violent offense with, their new OC Grimes, this is the time to catch them. You want to catch them early. So the Wisconsin game, it clearly would be an upset, but I would love to see it potentially boosting their chances to come out of the MAC and grab this automatic bid. And then Rutgers, right after that, I'm not terrified. I mean, these would be the kind of games that Chuck Martin wins. Like, let's muck it up. Let's try to win 20-17 and get out of there, steal the paycheck, steal the win, one hand in the other. I think this is a good opportunity in the right spot to grab my second MAC team. I'm probably too MAC heavy at this point, but in terms of the quarterbacks that I'm working with here out of the Mid-American, the coaches I'm working with, a lot of continuity, a lot of success. I don't think these teams are going to be afraid of going on the road against Power 4 competition, so I'll go with the Red Hawks.
Well, I'm going to join the MAC party with you because my surprise team in the MAC this season is the University at Buffalo, and I think Buffalo could surprise a lot of teams in MAC play again this season. I think that they really took some strides as a program last year in Pete Lembo's first season at Buffalo. I like who they bring in the portal with Taquan Roberson in at quarterback, who at times has really shown some flash when he's stayed healthy and been on the field. And so I think that he'll kind of be really similar to CJ Agbana and what he did last year for University of Buffalo. I know that they have a big loss in the linebacker room with Dolak, who was the heart and soul of their defense last season, but nearly everybody defensively returns at all three levels of the defense. They have really solid depth by MAC standards, and they have a lot of just catalyst pieces of their three layers of defense that they can rely on. Special teams is always going to be a solid focus with Pete Lembo coach teams. And if you look at the MAC schedule, there's no reason why this team shouldn't start 6-0 in MAC play, with Kent State, Eastern Michigan, UMass, Akron, Bowling Green, and Central Michigan on the slate. They'll be favored in every one of those games. And so really it comes down to the last two games that they hosting Miami of Ohio and hosting Ohio University, to determine whether or not they find their spot in Detroit for the MAC championship game. And they do have a spot where they can pull a signature win in week one. It'll take a spirited effort, and they are significant 16.5-point underdogs, but they go to Minnesota in week one, and not out of the realm of possibility for this feisty bunch to give PJ Fleck and the Gophers a really solid game here. So I like the team. I like the defensive and special teams focus. I like the schedule. Give me University of Buffalo here.
I like that. I was beating the drum for Pete Lembo. I think he's a great coach. He coached here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, up the road from me at Lehigh. So I was very excited to see him pump some juice into that program. Yeah, Red Murdoch is a killer at linebacker. So it's not as though they are, going to experience a massive drop off with him leading the charge there. It's just a question of Roberson, which is he's always had the talent. I mean, you don't even need to go through his recruiting profile. You can just watch him warm up. He looks different. And he's got some pretty good wide receivers out wide. It's just a question of, can he finally realize that potential? And if he does, they open against Minnesota, another rock fight kind of Big Ten team that you could steal a win from, and then all of a sudden shifts the perception of not just Buffalo, but also the MAC in general in terms of, where these teams are going to go for the rest of the season. We saw it last year. No one had Northern Illinois on their dance card beating Notre Dame, in South Bend, but they did. So I think there's an opportunity for some of these top teams in the MAC to score some meaningful upsets early on and then position themselves to be 4th, 5th in the futures market to get that auto bid for the G5. All right, there's actually 4 teams left for me. I'm excited. I was worried when I was putting this list together that you were going to snipe all of them. I got, let's see. Yeah, all of them are out of the American. So now my question is, do I want Tulane? Do I want Navy? Do I want South Florida? Do I want that new look offense with FAU? I'm going to rule out FAU, although I think their game in the opener against Maryland, that could be another dead coach walking in terms of P4 football, and they could end up going with Washington, that true freshman quarterback. But I just don't think they're going to have it defensively to be able to hold up even through the AAC. Tulane, I mentioned quarterback issues, losing Mensa, losing TJ Finley to legal issues. I think that's going to be a bugaboo for the Green Wave this season. So it's either Navy or USF. I think USF is going to upset one of the first 3 teams on their schedule. And for those not looking at their schedule right now, they got Boise at home. They're at the Florida Gators, at the Miami Hurricanes. It would be very Mario Cristobal of him to go ahead and lose to an in-state team looking, towards the ACC schedule. Maybe he upsets Notre Dame in that opener. They're feeling great. Carson Beck looks great. And then all of a sudden they come crashing back to earth. But even so, even if they get one of those wins, a 1-2 start leaves me no room for error. So I'm going to go with the middies. I'm going to go with the midshipmen out of Annapolis, Navy. They bring back so much offensively, and I'll talk about them a little bit more later in the show. They need to replace some starters on their offensive line, but the schedule sets up perfectly. It's like an extended preseason to be able to get that right. To have a quarterback like Horvath, who really is right there with a Ricky Dobbs, with a Keenan Reynolds in terms of I trust him with my life. He's got all of his weapons in terms of the backfield back and his fastest wide receiver out wide. Can they do enough defensively to either run the table in the AAC or score a huge upset against Notre Dame? They got run over last year by Notre Dame. So that was something that is on Drew Cronick now. they countered what you were doing. Can you counter their counter? That's the question really in year 2 of this system, because they caught a lot of teams off guard, a lot of teams napping with what they're doing with the hybrid millennial wing T. I'm going to go with them as my last pick because I think there's a good chance that they, vie for double-digit wins, 9 or 10 wins. And if you win the American, you are in the conversation. So I'm going to go with Service Academy.
Was my 5th pick as well, but I'll pivot there. I think Navy is certainly in for a special season. I like what they return on both sides of the ball. I think Horvath is a special talent. If they could just ever put it together against Notre Dame and give those guys a fight, it would really do wonders to their resume. If the lights weren't too bright and if they could just ever put it together, I think that would be really something special for Navy. So fantastic pick. Have nothing to argue with there, and that's who I would have selected in this spot. Since they're no longer available, I'll take San Jose State. Year 2 with the spread and shred and Ken Niumatalolo and Craig Stutzman in their system. I think that they'll be improved in the system, which was a complete 180 from what they were running at San Jose State before. I like Walker Eget back at quarterback, and I think that some of the receiver gets that they had in the portal could click and absorb the blow of generational wide receiver talent Nick Nash, who's no longer around. I think the schedule lines up fairly manageable. They've got a bye game at Texas that may not be very competitive, but outside of that, I think that really every game they play in Mountain West Conference play is one that this bunch will certainly be in. And I think this is just one of those situations for San Jose State where they've really embraced and bought into this identity with Ken Niumatalolo and this passing offense, and really buying into what they need to do to be successful, which we saw many times last year. I think they're going to build and improve on that. The defense was actually a pretty feisty bunch last season and really surprising in the metrics to see how well this team played. They were right there in the thick of it against Boise and UNLV late in the season, beat Stanford, beat Oregon State. I mean, this was a pretty impressive bunch, and I think that this is a group that will have their hand in what happens in the Mountain West Conference football race this season. And so we're kind of getting into the depths of G5 and really stretching at who may or may not be able to make the college football playoff. But last pick I'll take is San Jose State.
Yeah, San Jose State was certainly my radar. When you have a coach that you trust, Ken Niumatalolo has won so many games, been in tight games, knows how to manage a locker room, knows how to manage expectations. Walker Eget, I think, was an upgrade over Emmett Brown. Emmett Brown was someone who lost his job for a reason last year. And really, it's just a question of how do they replace in the aggregate what Nick Nash did. There's not a Nick Nash player walking through that door, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this offense is going to take a step back, because if they can continue to play at that level, certainly their defense around Pollard at linebacker, at least they have a star on that side of the ball. And if you want to have a star, you probably want him in the front 7 because you need to compete against Boise, who's still going to try to run the ball. So I think it gives them a puncher's chance. And certainly they threw a scare early on to the Broncos last year. So I don't dislike that pick. I think it's interesting, Tulane, for all of their talents. And I think we can both agree that we like their coach. It's just too much uncertainty at the quarterback position. And you look at that, I mean, just pull up the opening month of their season. Unlike a team like Navy, who gets that extended preseason that I mentioned, they got some really tough opponents. I think, Ole Miss in there. You can help me out with the rest of them, but there's an opportunity for them to not only take some lumps, but play their way out of the conversation by the time we get to October. And I think that's a reason why they ended up not going in the top 10 of our draft here.
Yeah, and I actually wrote this up for Action Network, and we talked about this on a prior show, but I took Tulane's regular season win total under 8.5. I think there's just too much turmoil with the roster overhaul to assume a 9-win season. Now, this bunch still could have their hand in what happens in AAC play, but when they play Northwestern, Duke, South Alabama, and Ole Miss in the non-conference, I just don't necessarily assume that they chew through that schedule 3-1. I think there's a second loss there. I think it's Northwestern in the opener. I already have Northwestern plus 7.5 in pocket. I think Northwestern has upgraded significantly, and it's going to be a much more dynamic offense with less predictability that we've come to know and love with Northwestern in the past. And I think that Tulane is just one of those teams that has talent-wise kind of stagnated or even dropped just slightly, while there's another 2 or 3 teams in the AAC that are going to kind of creep up to their level. Now, when you look at Tulane in conference play as well, they've got 2 tough road trips at UTSA and at Memphis, which will really be challenging spots for this group. And oh, by the way, in the middle of their schedule, hosting a feisty bunch and a proud group in ECU and hosting Army will be no cakewalks either. So I think Tulane still could have a bit of a say in what happens in AAC play, but I think there's going to be some out-of-conference losses, and I just don't see this bunch really threatening the playoff with an 8-4 record.
I kind of teased it a little bit in terms of the overall coaching carousel. The P4, there's been less movement than usual, and I think a big part of that are the buyouts and the impact of if you're spending that much money to replace your coach and get a new one, do you have anything left in the war chest to keep up on the player, the NIL, the financial inducements to come to your university side of it, that roster building. It's essentially like how much money you have under the salary cap in professional leagues. And if you're burning through that just to get the right coach in and the wrong coach out, then all of a sudden, maybe you're drawing dead. So for that reason, there wasn't a ton of movement at the P4 level. That's not true at the Group of Five level. A lot of new faces, a lot of musical chairs, coaches moving up, coaches sliding in from the FCS level. With all that being said, there's going to be a lot of teams that look very different, and we'll get into that in terms of coordinator and schematic conversations in a moment. But let's first start with some head coaches that you're either looking to tail or fade this season. Let's go back and forth. You can start us off.
Yeah, and I think this first one here is a hire that does have the potential to work out long term, but this season I think he was just put in an impossible situation. Jason Eck at New Mexico steps into a situation where it's a place that's already really hard to recruit to. They are in their third coach in 3 seasons, which makes this situation even more difficult. But New Mexico was decimated in the portal. Our guy Damp is off to Utah, and it's going to be impossible to replace his production. They're 135th overall in returning production, 128th on offense, 133rd on defense. And whatever you saw from New Mexico last season offensively with the electric play of Dampier, the explosive running game, some of the passing that they had, throw that out the window because this is going to be a complete 180. They're bringing in a new offensive coordinator who was with Jason Eck at Idaho, and they are going to play a very, very slow tempo pace. They're going to be run heavy with a ball control approach, and this offense is really going to, in my opinion, struggle to find their footing. They're not going to replace the electric and heroic play of Dampier with who they have in the quarterback room coming in, and they lose their top 7 receivers from last season. The offensive line is an absolute complete rebuild. Last year, the defense was really, really bad, but it was kind of overshadowed by all of the good that their offense was able to produce. Only 3 of the top 19 tacklers returned from last season. The secondary just appears to be in really, really bad shape. This was a bunch last season that allowed 30 touchdown passes to just 3 total interceptions, and they are now relying on 3 FCS transfers to shore up the back end. This front 7 last season for New Mexico only secured 11 total sacks, and they went 6 games without securing a sack. And this front 7 was a bunch that gave up 5.4 yards per carry in the trenches. So I look for this defense to make maybe marginal improvements, but not enough, and it's going to be significantly exposed when the offense puts this defense in bad situations, and they're not going to get bailed out by the high-scoring electricity of Devon Dampier. I've already looked to fade them in a couple of spots this season. At Michigan, I've taken Michigan minus 34.5, logged in the award-winning Action Network app. I'm looking to fade them at Boise State and at Air Force. But just look at the road games in totality. They're at Michigan, at UCLA, at San Jose State, Boise on the road, UNLV, and Air Force. Just a brutal slate. There's 3 games at home that are going to be really tough with Utah State, Colorado State, and an emerging San Diego State team. And it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of winnability here in the schedule for New Mexico this season. This bunch could improve marginally on the field in some capacity, but I don't think it's going to show up in the win-loss column. And I think the offense, when they find themselves down 14 or 17 points midway through the third quarter, there's just too many games that could just go sideways for this bunch. So I do look to fade New Mexico this season.
It's going to be a bit of a seesaw. When you fade, I'm going to come back with a team and head coach that I want to tail, a little bit of positivity. let's start with Rice. The Owls went out and got Scott Abel. And I think it's a perfect marriage, to be honest, because he was a turnaround specialist at the high school level. Then he wins big as a coordinator and head coach at Washington Lee, a D3 program in Virginia. He works his same magic at Davidson, which was a program operating without scholarships. He took him to 3 straight FCS playoffs, despite the fact, as I mentioned, that roster issue where you're dealing with 0-star, 1-star players. The reason why he was able to do that and squeeze so much out of those rosters was his innovative option attack. It was influenced by that Tom Osborne under center kind of I-back option. But as he worked from high school to the college level, he ended up pulling it back into the shotgun sets. And his gun option at Washington Lee and Davidson, if you look at the last 15 years, now granted it's the D3 and FCS level, 10 of those 15 years, his teams led the nation in rushing. That is how innovative he is. There's coaches around the country that steal tidbits of his offense and what he does and how he's able to put different defenders in conflict. And when you do that and you're moving around the player that you're keying on the defense, it makes it difficult to be aggressive defensively. And I think what it ends up doing is it kind of evens out some of that athletic imbalance at the line of scrimmage, because people aren't essentially attacking you in terms of what they're doing defensively, and it puts teams on their heels. And that's why he's been able to rack up so many rushing yards. This is just a team that this year, even with some new pieces and the fact that they're also trying to adjust to a new system, I think just the imbalance of what they're putting on film on a week-to-week basis and the homework that they're giving teams in the AAC, they're going to be a bitch to prepare for. And that's why, as I said, this marriage between a coach that knows how to win with scrappy, blue-collar, 0-star kind of guys and a program that has struggled historically to get some of the top talent in their own state because they have such high academic standards. I like Rice a lot. I've already put it in the Action Network app over on their win total this year. I'm going to strategically pull them in a bunch of spots where they're catching points, because what are they going to do? Like any good service academy in sheep's clothing, just like a Vanderbilt, a Georgia Tech, they're going to shrink that game down. Forget about 18, 19 possession games. Give me an 11 possession game in which one turnover that goes in their favor all of a sudden swings it in terms of an against the spread perspective. So I love Abel and I love the Rice Owls this year.
Yeah, and we have another segment coming up, and so I'll touch briefly and add a few pieces on that in that segment, but I think it's an exquisite hire for Rice, and I think it's exactly what that program will need. We'll get into that here shortly. The next coach that I'm going to fade is Marshall and Tony Gibson. I think that this is a real unique situation for Tony Gibson, who's been a career DC over 25 years. We saw the mass exodus from Marshall after they won the Sun Belt Championship game last season. They really just could not get on the same page and never bought into Charles Huff, unfortunately, and the benefactor of that will be Southern Miss and their 180 team that we'll see look completely different from last season to this season. But talking Marshall, I mean, this season, it just looks to be nearly impossible with the insane amount of roster turnover. The league schedule is really quite tough when you look at the opponents that they play in Sun Belt play. The returning production on offense and defense lost is just tremendously impactful. 130th overall in returning production, 125th on offense, 123rd on defense. They just do not really have the personnel to really even appropriate a 2-deep with any talented roster. They're going to really struggle when you look at the Sun Belt schedule and the crossovers, Louisiana Lafayette and Texas State. They also have tough games at home against JMU, Georgia Southern. There are some road games that would be possibly categorized as winnable, but good luck going to Georgia State, App State, and Coastal Carolina on the road with this bunch. I've already faded this group on the win total under 5.5, which is logged. I'm considering looking at the conference wins under 3.5. I just don't see a real path to success for Marshall piling up the wins this season. I think that they were probably getting a little too much preseason respect this year based on the fact that these were the Sun Belt champs. But this will be a completely different team, probably 12 points based on my power ratings, 12 points worse than the team last season. And my goodness, with all the different teams that they have to play on this schedule, to include Georgia Southern, Louisiana, Texas State, Old Dominion's a feisty bunch, App State, and then closing out with Georgia Southern, this is just there's too much that has to go right for this group to find themselves in a bowl game. And I've got a lot of room on the win total. I've got this team pegged for 4-8 or 3-9. So 5.5, 5. I think we're good on the win total, and under 3.5 conference wins.
I'm going to go with a coach to tail as an over bet throughout the season. Look at these totals, just go over. I don't care how high they are. And that's Zach Kittley and the Florida Atlantic Owls this season. I've seen this movie before. This goes back to the very first season of the Group of Five Deep Dive when Kittley and Zappy came over with Jarrett Stearns at wide receiver and a host of other Houston Baptist transfers. And they took the world by storm. Zappy set the FBS record for passing yards and touchdowns in a season. And Western went 10-4 against the spread, and critically 10-4 to the over in their games that season. It just took too long for the market to correct to what they were doing in terms of throwing the ball all over the yard. And now you got Kittley, finally a head coach, this wonderkin offensive mind, reuniting with a quarterback that he recruited at Western in Caden Veldkamp. He brings his favorite target from Western as well, and Easton Messer with him. And the buzz out of the spring was the continuity, him understanding the system, the calls, having some of his favorite weapons with him. He looked sharp as hell in spring ball. And that's what's interesting, too. You have to dig a little bit deeper in terms of some of the beat writers for this G5 schools because some teams didn't even have public spring games because all the G5 schools are kind of huddling together. We don't want to show what we have because somebody could portal out of the program. So let's keep, our cards close to our chest here. And, some of the beat reporters still do a good job in terms of, the continuity or who looked good in the spring, and they'll sprinkle out little notes, but there's not as much video out there. So there's not quite as much buzz as we naturally would have with an offense like this. This is the buzzy offense in the AAC, in my opinion. If the offensive line holds up, I think they'll pop offensively. They only return one full-time starter along the line. Now, some of this system can help mitigate, some of the holes and having a leaky ship up front in terms of quick throws, in terms of those, bubble screens and getting the ball out of Veldkamp's hands. Certainly not a dynamic thrower on the run. With that said, they still need to show me, and this is the reason I didn't draft them in our top 10 of, G5 schools to get that auto bid. So I think that's a legitimate issue. Defensively, though, this is why this is an over bet for me. Basically all 12 regular season games. They return donut hole, 0 starters on defense, 120th in returning production. Brett Dewhurst is in his mid-30s, and Alex Kaloje, recently on Slack here at Action was kind of busting my chops. He goes, I almost want to try to catfish you with a fake coordinator hire, create a Wikipedia page. Oh, he's a 23-year-old coordinator. Calabrese is always just going to, sink his teeth into whoever's the new young coordinator calling plays. Fair. First of all, fair. I do love these angles, but I'm going to say this. Dewhurst has never called plays before, and he's going to be doing it with a super green unit. I don't love that combination. What I do love is a young coach that maybe got some coordinator experience calling plays at the FCS level and has bumped his way up. But I think they went a little bit too aggressive with this hire for a team and a coaching staff that's already really young. They got some potential in terms of the starters that they were able to pluck from the portal on the defensive side, from Minnesota, from Rutgers. They got a really nice edge rusher in Eric Brantley Jr., so they're not completely devoid of talent. I just think it's unlikely for them to field even a top 8 defense in the AAC. So give me the overs, shootout city throughout the year. As I mentioned, that opener, I'm going to take the points against the Terps. I'm going to parlay that with over. I think it's going to be a very fun team to watch. I'm hoping it is on the level of the Hilltoppers from the Bailey Zappi era. That may be a lot to ask for, but I think the ingredients are there. What do you think about the Owls and this hire coming off of the Tom Herman era and really some quarterback play that left a ton to be desired?
Well, I find it interesting because in another segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the FAU Owls, and I'll assure our listeners today, we don't compare notes before this process. It's just so interesting we've landed on some of these same teams that we've wanted to discuss because of the complete change in offensive and defensive systems. And this is going to be another one that's absolutely extreme in FAU. You're going to see a high-flying offense that's going to be pass-happy. You hit the nail right on the head. This is going to be Zappy 2.0. This is going to be get your quarterback, get your OC, bring in some of the receivers, get the system that you want, grip it and let it rip. And the defense is going to be what the defense is going to be. And I think that they might just be better off putting 11 folding chairs out there at times because the defense may not stop a lot. What you're going to see is give me the high side, like you had just said, a lot of overs, a lot of high-flying affairs. a lot of bouts, particularly early in the season. Maryland could be a very high-scoring game. Florida International. The Rice game will be real interesting to see if they can try to draw up anything to stop that electric offense that's coming over from Davidson. UAB, that could be a high-flying affair. South Florida, Navy, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And I think that this is just going to be a bunch until we get adjusted totals posted. You're going to have no choice but to go over. I couldn't stomach betting an FAU under with the personnel they have on defense and with what we know they have coming back with the offensive system that they're implementing.
Your next pick, another fade of a new head coach. I'm hoping that the Eddie George hire works. In some of these cases, particularly when you want to go to a more physical attack, when you want to be able to play bully ball, you need to have the pieces. You can kind of smoke and mirror it a little bit in terms of, these spread passing attacks or, one or two guys pop in your receiver room, and then all of a sudden you can be dynamic on the perimeter, but you can't fake it. I mean, you can throw some extra tight ends out there. You can throw H-backs and fullbacks and, try to go with that early, Jim Harbaugh style at Stanford before he got Andrew Luck in the fold. But I'm just not quite there in year zero. It feels like a year zero situation with Bowling Green, despite the recent success under Loeffler. So take me through this.
Yeah, I Ziggy Zumba. I mean, I want to love Bowling Green, and I think we all here at Action Network fell in love with Bowling Green, namely due to their exquisite talent and Harold Fannin, who is really a guy they would really love to have in this system this season. But replacing that production is just going to be impossible. Eddie George comes into the process late. He wasn't hired until March 9th, so he already had a late start. The returning production at Bowling Green was very low, namely on defense, 127th overall, and it's a complete and full rebuild on a defense that really carried the Falcons last season. We saw it when they played up in competition, and they had exquisite performances at Penn State and at A&M where they were outclassed in the roster, and those were very competitive football games deep into the fourth quarter. And they won those, or they competed in those games and won against the spread because of the play of their defense late that they didn't wear down. And in MAC play, they really were able to step up in some key spots. Finally got over the hump against Toledo, and it was really because of their defense late in the first half that had some timely turnovers and set their offense up for scores. But that defense is completely gone. The pass rushers are gone. The people who created havoc in the backfield, Jordan Oladokun, who was one of their outstanding secondary players, is gone. And it's going to be really tough for me to see this defense gain a lot of traction. Now, offensively, like you had said with Eddie George, this offense wants to be physical. They want to line up and play power football. We should see plenty of 12 and 13 personnel sets. And what that means is your personnel sets are set by numbers. 12 would be one running back, two tight ends, which is common in the game of football. 13 personnel is one running back, three tight ends, which is less common, but still something that you'll see deployed where you have one tailback and two or three tight ends. And they just don't have a lot of the talented bodies at that tight end position that would provide passing threats. And who knows how they're going to be run blocking. It's just going to be one of those things where we might see them kind of piecemeal an offense together that they have an idea of what they want to be, but they don't have the reps, and they just don't have the experience and the muscle memory of the cadence of doing it. And so I just don't see necessarily how it's going to go. They lose their top four pass catchers from last season, including Harold Fannin, which was just all worldly. Their top four rushers from last season are gone. And I just think that the offense is going to be much more of a struggle than what you would expect, but it is year zero. Now, when you dive into the schedule, I did fade Bowling Green on the win total. We've got it logged. We talked about it earlier in the summer, under 6.5. The non-conference slate is tough with Cincinnati, Louisville, and Liberty on the non-conference slate. You're probably looking at a 1-3 start. And then who do they have to open up MAC play? They've got at Ohio, and then in a Toledo revenge spot, they host Toledo. My numbers have them as underdogs of about 6.5 to 8.5 points in each of those contests. And you're looking at a team that could potentially start 1-5. So now what's the mental psyche of a team with a brand new coach? You've got this influx of talent that hasn't been growing up in the program. You're 1-5. What are you playing for? Are you going to fold your tent and fade, or do you rally the troops? To me, it just seems like this season is all about fighting fighting, clawing, and scratching to 6-6. I just don't see this team piling up the wins. The second half of the schedule becomes a little lighter, but they still have Buffalo on the schedule and Central and Eastern Michigan, which will certainly be no gimmies. They've got Kent State, Akron, and UMass on the slate, so there will be some certainly winnable games and games they'll be expected to win. But to expect 7-5, just absolutely no chance, in my opinion. There's too much going on. He started too late in the process. They're going to be relying on a lot of talent from Tennessee State, who had a good season as an FCS program last year, but that transitional talent may not necessarily be there. So with the tough start, I worry about the mental psyche of this group. I worry about how they're going to look on both sides of the ball. And I really think Bowling Green stubbed their toe in a couple games last year, and it should have been their season last season, but couldn't put it together against Miami of Ohio and couldn't put it together against Northern Illinois and didn't get to Detroit. They won't this year, and I think they struggle to make a bowl game.
I love you, Eddie George. I hope you get everybody rowing in the right direction soon. But I agree. I think it's more likely than not that it's, a 1-5, 2-4 start. And then it just becomes no room for error in terms of the win total and certainly for bowl eligibility and, that strive for 6. So I think it's going to be difficult. I think if the administration gives them time and they're able in the next portal session and the next offseason to be able to get in and get some of those bigger bodies and those hybrid players that can both be blockers but also be dynamic in the passing game, all of a sudden I think things start moving in the right direction. And then how he uses his celebrity, certainly in terms of attracting interest. At the end of the day, you still have to be able to fundraise and open up the coffers and get some money out to these players. But at least by max standards, you have a big head start with a name brand like Eddie, having started in a Super Bowl and been so dynamic for Tennessee and everything that he did in terms of all his rushing yardage, his touchdowns. He's a name brand, so I'm glad to see him in the MAC, a conference that certainly has not had a lot of sex appeal in terms of head coaching hires over the years. All right, I am finally going to go in the opposite direction. No more positivity out of me. I'm going to fade a young coach, really off-brand for me. I just don't get this hire from Tulsa, a program that, really had been interesting. It had been innovative offensively. You saw, a handful of coaches come through in the last 20 years that were able to do more with less and put teams, in conflict in the passing game, in the run game, put up some huge numbers with their quarterbacks, be a launching pad for a guy like Brennan Marion, who ended up learning a lot from his coaches, being so dynamic there. Now he's one of the rising stars. He's off at Sacramento State. I hope to see him at the FBS level soon. But they're going with Trey Lamb, a 35-year-old head coach who is 27-25 in 4 full seasons at the FCS level. He also had a couple games there in the weird COVID year. He did well at Gardner-Webb, but here's the thing. You're the perfect audience for this little nugget. The Big South was a dreadful conference before it merged with the OVC at the FCS level, and still it's like at best a middle-class FCS conference. It's certainly not up there with the big boys getting multiple teams in on an annual basis. So, the fact is, I think he would be a better candidate to go be a coordinator at the FBS level. To be at a job like Tulsa, I think this is a bit of a reach. I certainly think in coaching circles, he's viewed as an innovator on the offensive side of the ball. But when I look at this, not only is it, difficult for me to envision that he's going to be able to get the defense going in the right direction, but if they're going to win shootouts, because, the 27-25 record, when you double click into it, when he faced ranked FCS teams, they always got shredded. They gave up over 33 points per game in all of his games against ranked FCS opponents. So Tulsa, in my opinion, is not cut out year one to be getting into these track meets. They got 3 starters returning on offense, and that includes Kirk Francis. Kirk O'Chains, he is not. His QBR of 27.7 last year was 125th in the country, so should he even be the starter? Defensively, they also returned just 3 starters from a unit that almost allowed 500 yards per game. That was 132nd in the entire country. And when I look at this schedule, Abilene Christian in the opener, they were an FCS playoff team last year. You got to win that game. Otherwise, I think it throws a wet blanket over all the enthusiasm for a new coaching staff right out of the chute. Then they travel to New Mexico State, which is a winnable game. I hope they win both, to be honest with you, because this is one of those teams and candidates where I want to see them have some empty calories, go 2-0, and then the casual betting public sees 2-0 next to the Tulsa name and says, all right, I mean, they're feisty. They certainly should be, viable as an underdog in the AAC, You look at this AAC schedule, they play 5 of the top 6 finishers in the conference from a year ago. They also travel to Oklahoma State. They got a home tilt with Oregon State. I think they're going to get bombed by some of these teams. I see a 2-10 season on tap for Trey Lamb in year one. You got to pony up to play the under, and I think Vegas, our friends in the desert, agree with me. To go under the 3.5, you got to pay the minus 150. Pay it. I would pay an alternate to go under 3. I think there's a much better chance they go 2-10 than they go 4-8. I just don't see them having the pieces to cook offensively, and his track record defensively is troubling. I don't see the dudes in this front seven or in the secondary helping them out here in year one, which is really a year 0 in Tulsa.
Yeah, and the defense has such a long way to go. Gave up 4.9 yards per carry last season and 66% completions. They played Northwestern State, who is a very, very weak Southland Conference FCS foe. They're a bottom 10 FCS team, and they gave up 28 points to that bunch, the same bunch that lost 87-10 against South Alabama later on in the season. This group also gave up 52 points against North Texas, 59 against UAB, and then we just saw complete quit out of this defense the last 2 weeks of the season when they gave up 63 points at South Florida and 63 points against Florida Atlantic. Shredded defensively, week in and week out was Tulsa, and there's just a long way to go. Now, I will say that Trey Lamb was able to turn around some of these FCS programs quickly. He was aided by the transfer portal and bringing in some of his guys. I don't necessarily know that that's going to work necessarily in this season, and the slate is quite tough. I think when you look at Navy, Tulane, Memphis, East Carolina, I mean, at Army, it's not a situation where you're going to pile up a lot of wins. I do think there are some spots where Tulsa can be good against the number, namely that week 5 bout where Tulane has to come to town and they'll probably be catching 21 or so at home. And then there's another spot later on in the season where Oregon State has to come to Tulsa, and depending on the line there, which could be another huge number of points we're catching, they could be okay against the number in situations of that nature. But broad brush painting, I don't see a ton of wins for Tulsa. I think that this is a bunch that's probably a year away, and maybe the coach was a year away too from this level. So I think it could be a little bit of a tough situation with Tulsa, specifically on defense. I know they got a couple guys in the portal that they're really excited about, but just way, way down last year on the defensive side of the ball, and too much ground needs to be made up for them to host or to keep some of these top opponents in the AAC down. I just don't see it.
2 more segments. We're going to go through the most impactful scheme changes year to year, and we're also going to get into our favorite quarterbacks at the G5 level. So walk me through some of the complete reboots, offensively, defensively, whether it's a head coach, whether it's an offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator coming in, because these are the kind of things to be in the know about that you can hit the ground running in terms of your week 0, week 1 bets before the rest of the general public catches up.
Well, yeah, we saw it with Rice last season when they had E.J. Warner at the helm, and they really tried to embrace kind of the pass-happy offense where they were attempting to at least spread it around. It didn't necessarily work to the level that they were hoping with E.J., who's now off to Fresno State. But I won't be long-winded here because we had talked extensively about Rice. They bring in Scott Abel. They bring in this inverted option attack with a lot of nuances and quirks that does not really mimic a traditional triple option. It's inverted in nature, and it's really a situation where a lot of his formations will call for potentially 4 ball carriers in any one play. So there's really dynamic elements to this Davidson offense. It is electric to watch when it's humming. Not a lot of programs are going to be able to say this, but here at the Action Network, we covered plenty of FCS football last season. Davidson was a part of that. The thing that I think will really help this bunch for Scott Abel and Rice is he's used to coaching at programs that are academically minded. He already mentioned the D3 school that he coached at, which is a non-scholarship level. Now, he coached FCS Davidson, who plays in the Pioneer Football League, which is a non-scholarship level. He was coaching athletes who wanted to participate at the football program for the love of the game and to attend the college. They were not being paid to be there. And so he's used to overcoming challenges of limited funding and not having the scholarship level athletes and kind of being behind the 8 ball of other teams that he is up against in recruiting. And so with Rice, they're the Harvard of the South, and they are a really tough academic institution to get into. You're limited in nature to the athletes that you're able to recruit to the university. And so I think that'll really help him in being able to recruit at a high level from the talent pool that he's able to pull from, because he's just so used to talking their language. And so when he gets the people in there that can run that system and be able to kind of get some repetition in fall camp with this offense, it's going to look nothing like Rice offenses that we've seen in the past. You had hit home on it, so I'm not going to harp on it any further, but Rice is going to look completely different, and it is going to be a thing of beauty to watch week in and week out. I think they'll get it going pretty quickly down there in Houston.
We already talked about how Marshall basically was an organ donor to Southern Miss. Let's talk about Southern Miss for a second, because not only does Huff go down there, but he hires a new offensive coordinator in Blake Anderson. Mm-hmm. He, unceremoniously was kicked out of Utah State. Then there's been legal proceedings, and it seems as though he may not have been in the wrong, or certainly to the point where if he was guilty of everything that was alleged in terms of reporting sexual assaults and those issues, he'd be out of coaching for the rest of his life. So he's actually filed a lawsuit against his former employer. So he's back in the game now. And just between the lines, let's talk about what Blake Anderson is as a play caller. This is a program at Southern Miss who hasn't been able to throw the ball in years. This was a program just a couple of years ago where using Frank Gore as a wildcat quarterback was the best option that they had. But his 3 years as the head coach at Utah State, you look at 2021, Logan Bonner, breakout year. He threw for 41 touchdowns. The Aggies threw 41 touchdowns as a team. 2022, Bonner gets hurt. Bit of a mess in terms of their depth chart. They're, shuffling quarterbacks. But then once they had, health in hand in 2023 with Cooper Lega, they get back to chucking around all over the yard, 35 touchdowns through the air as a program. And then when you look back at what he did at Arkansas State before that, Justice Hansen looked like an absolute star for the Red Wolves, 44 total touchdowns, 4,300 total yards in 2017. I mean, Southern Miss would have settled for half of that production last year. They would have been a viable team at the FBS level if they had that. So even if it is a multi-quarterback system, when he had Lane Hatcher and Logan Bonner at Arkansas State at times, it still worked really well. And now when you look at Braxton coming down from Marshall, he had an awesome season last year. He was absolutely locked in, 19-2 touchdown to interception ratio, a really strong transfer portal class at wide receiver, a running back room that has some SEC talent in it. I expect this offense to jump. The question is, how much does it jump? And I can kind of put this to you, Duck, in terms of where you think they could land in terms of, let's just say, that the SP plus offensive projections. 130th is where they ended last year. They were the bottom of the barrel. They were dysfunctional. It was a team that needed to clean house in more ways than one. I think that they could make a jump and vie to be in the top 75 offensively. I think that's how much the quarterback and play caller give them an upgrade. And I think I could look back on it and say that I undersold them and they end up winning the Sun Belt. I got a ticket at 25-1. I know our buddy Colin Wilson is sitting on a 40-1 ticket. Those numbers are not out there in the same way in the market right now. You can still get that 25-30 if you go out and shop. If this all clicks offensively and the perimeter weapons work with Braxton, I think Anderson is going to be one of those coaching hires that we look back on. He resuscitated his career. He'll be a head coach again in 2 years, and this will be a special season for USM. What are your thoughts on Anderson's impact down in Hattiesburg?
Well, it'll be a real watershed moment for this program. When you look back at the last 4 seasons, they've been just riddled with injuries and ineptitude at the quarterback position, and it's really handcuffed this program's ability to get out of the basement of the Sun Belt. And we're still seeing this group being penalized by the sticker on the side of their helmet rather than the players that are in the jerseys and the people that are on the coaching staff. And I don't think Vegas has quite caught up to the talent infusion that this group has brought in and how night and day different the coaching is going to be. I expect this to be a feisty bunch all season and a group that will pile up the wins and nothing short of 6-6. I think you can still find a regular season win total over 4.5. Now, the juice is not going to be what the juice was when you and I bet this earlier in the summer and talked about it here with the Action Network, but you can still find that number, which I think is a 1.5 light. And I think that you're going to find a completely much more cohesive and electric offensive unit, which at times was just so terrible to watch last season. There was just such a lack of continuity. They couldn't get out of their own way pertaining to allowing negative plays. I mean, my goodness, 45 sacks given up last year, 34 each of the last 2 years prior to that. The red zone numbers were down. The yards per carry were low. They just couldn't get out of their own way when you look at a lot of the explosivity metrics and really simple counting metrics when it comes to the offensive output. But with Braylon Braxton in at quarterback and his 19-2 touchdown to interception ratio and the ability for him to create on the move, along with the infusion of talent that they have in the skill position rooms from the P4 and cohesiveness on the offensive line with Blake Anderson and his scheme and his ability to draw stuff up on the whiteboard, I think Southern Miss is a play-on team time and time again this upcoming 2025 season.
Now, we already talked about FAU. We don't have to belabor the point. We're hoping that it's Bailey Zappi 2.0. Pew, pew, pew. Hopefully big points there down in Florida. But talk to me about New Mexico a little bit in terms of their tempo, their style, and kind of the brand of football that they're going to play and how different it's going to be from the Devin Dampier experience.
Yeah, well, it is going to be a significantly different approach, and it's really due to the coaching style of Jason Eck and their offensive coordinator that they bring in, which is Luke Schleissner, comes in from Idaho. They run a lot of power packages. New Mexico last season had some electricity in the running game, not only from the quarterback position, but they used, and for seasons in prior as well, they had some quirkiness with some of the offense that they would run, and they were still a running team with some vertical downfield passing. But this Idaho bunch is going to be one that's going to possess the football. When you look at the reports for what Idaho did and what this team wants to do this season with the lack of talent infusion, they know they're behind the eight ball, so it's going to be slow and methodical. They're going to try to play the field position game. I anticipate very, very little explosiveness as they're breaking in everybody on the receiver room that's new as they lose their top 7. And Jack Lane at quarterback comes in from Idaho, and he was a serviceable FCS quarterback, but he did not light the world on fire. He struggled with injury. The downfield passing was just virtually non-existent, and Idaho had good FCS receivers that have moved on, and so they had some talent for their level, and it just was not explosive. It's going to be run on first down, run on second down, short pass on third down. They're going to try to chew clock, stay on the field, be methodical, and it's just going to be a complete grind. Now, last season, the offensive line numbers were not terrible in the amount of tackles for loss and sacks surrendered, but all of that has to be attributed to the heroic effort of Devin Dampier. If you just turn on the film, you'll see him running for his life time and time again with linemen who are just standing around watching him do it, not blocking anybody. And this season, when that happens, it is going to be havoc surrendered in the backfield, sacks, negative plays. I would anticipate that this New Mexico bunch is behind the chains a ton, and I just don't see what we saw last season in any way. Last season, we saw the highest Vegas over-under posted in years in their New Mexico game against Utah State. It was 87.5, and the game soared over, and it was just one of those where the DNA of the team was, we're going to outscore you, we can't stop you. If you remember Air Force, they struggled pitifully for 8 games in the season before they turned it around. Well, New Mexico allowed 37 points to Air Force, 45 to Utah State, and 40 points to an anemic New Mexico State who may have had the worst quarterback room in FBS football last season. This defense just could not stop anybody, so they were constantly in shootouts. Well, the offense knows that the defense is going to be poor once again, so slow it down, run the ball, try to play some field position. It's going to look nothing like what we saw the last couple of seasons in Albuquerque.
Before we get out of this segment, a few people reached out during the offseason. What are we doing with Trent Dilfer? What are we doing with UAB? They made a change at defensive coordinator. He finally got rid of his, high school coaching buddy, got himself a real adult, Steve Russ. He was an FBS defensive coordinator at Air Force from 2012 to 2017. When you're coaching at a service academy, you learn how to squeeze the most out of the talent that you have on hand. You're not going to have 4- and 5-star players. They're going to be more fundamentally sound, the Blazers, this year. I think he's going to instill discipline. But when you look in and you look under the hood at what the Falcons were defensively, some of their numbers were a little bit misleading in terms of their total defense, because obviously they're playing ball control, playing keep away offensively, but they had multiple years where they gave up a lot of points. So while I think they could have a bit of a schematic upgrade, and I think some of their fundamentals and clearly some of their tackling that, the second half of that season kind of fell off a cliff in terms of blown coverages, in terms of allowing people to run through arm tackles, they could shore some of that up. But the UAB defense, it's all new guys. They're 114th in returning production. So when people ask, are we going to continue to fade Trent Dilfer? Hell yeah, brother. Bring on more. I still think I think Trent Dilfer was surprised. I imagine him with the box, packing everything up. AD pops his head in. Hey, could you stay for another year? Me? Yes. You, Trent Dilfer, you're going to be coaching at least for the first month of this season. They simply don't have the horses to compete even in the AAC. And while this is an upgrade in terms of having an actual full-fledged adult who knows how to coordinate a defense, I don't think that's going to be enough to move off this fade train. So I'm going to go against UAB early and often again. Looking forward to that this season. All right, let's close out with just some pure positivity, some QBs in the G5 landscape that we love. Let's break it down into three separate categories. We got your superstar, we got your old reliable, which can be difficult because the transfer portal has moved so many quality quarterbacks up or across conferences. But we're looking for somebody that exactly what you're going to get. And then we're going to finish it out with something that's has really made this podcast famous in terms of Zappy, in terms of Diego Pavia. We're looking for that breakout star. All right, so let's lead off with your superstar. Who do you see absolutely shining the brightest in the 2025 season?
I see Caden Veldkamp, Conference USA Player of the Year for Western Kentucky last season, who broke out on the scene in their bowl game in 2023, where he shredded South Alabama for 383 yards and 5 passing touchdowns. Last year, he threw for 3,108 yards and 25 touchdowns while being extremely efficient and accurate, completing 66%. He's familiar with the offense, as you had alluded to in your talks with FAU earlier in the program. They bring in Easton Messer from WKU. This duo hooked up for 55 receptions and 793 yards last season. There's a lot of talent that comes in the skill rooms. Veldkamp was lights out in the spring game and still has 2 seasons of eligibility left. So you talk about a guy who can really create a legacy for himself and leave his mark on Group of 5 football. I would anticipate Veldkamp to absolutely shred opposing defenses this season in the AAC, and I would look to watch the passing yards and touchdowns pile up. And it's going to have to, because this defense for FAU is unlikely to stop anyone. So I see high-scoring affairs and plenty of stats for Veldkamp.
All right, take me to the Riverwalk. I want Owen McCown. Meet me, give me UTSA, the Roadrunners, QB1. If you just go to a family barbecue for the McCowns, you're going to see his dad, Josh, his uncle, Luke. They played cumulatively 30 years in the NFL, 120 NFL touchdowns from his family tree. Really impressive. He always had it in him to be a star at the college level. Second half of last year, Trailer just let this kid cook, and he delivered, as I mentioned at the top. They went 5-2 down the stretch, almost upset Army. 17 TDs across those last 7 games, and massive passing days against some of those leaky AAC units, FAU, Tulsa, and UNT. In those 3 games, he threw for 1,153 yards. They're the only G5 offense with every starter back. I don't even think this is accounting for how good they could be if JT Clark returns to his pre-injury status, because if they go 3 and 4 wide receivers and just let McCown, the lefty, just sling it all over the yard, I think some really good things are going to happen. I am excited for this kid this year. I think he's going to be a superstar. I think he's going to lead UTSA back to the promised land, an American championship. So give me McCown. All right, I'm going to hop right into my old reliable, Blake Horvath. Listen, all his key weapons are back. And as I mentioned at the top of the episode, they got to work in some new starters in the offensive line, including both tackles, which is not quite as important as it would be in a traditional drop back passing game. Luckily, they had that extended preseason. And when I say preseason, why am I going that harsh against their schedule? VMI, the Keydets, UAB and Trent Dilfer's defense, Tulsa and Rice, all before the calendar turns to October. That's a lot of time to get some of those reps in, where suddenly first-time starters feel a little bit closer to seasoned veterans by the time you get in October. most ideal schedule you can ask for. There's no two ways about it. This millennial wing T, I think it perfectly positions him to do a little damage through the air. He threw, I believe, 13 passing touchdowns last fall. That was the most by a midshipman passer since 2010 when Ricky Dobbs did it. And now Drew Cronick, he is a mad scientist. He has found a way, whether it's, the rail routes, the wheel routes, running back angles, spreading people out, getting it to Kent on the perimeter. He's finding ways to keep defenses from just stacking the box. And for that reason, you want to have an old reliable quarterback, and they got it in Blake Horvath. So I just view this as long as people can stay healthy, you're never going to have the depth at the Service Academy level. But in terms of being a veteran presence and someone that I trust with the ball in his hands, he is someone who's responsible not just for those, putting the ball in harm's way through the air, but he's got so many reads and pitches and pulls to make on any given Saturday. I want someone that I trust. I trust this guy implicitly. And I think really you're going to see another hot start for them. This was how it started last year. Late, potentially we can get into to fading another Service Academy. They got trips to North Texas, Notre Dame, Memphis, a home game with South Florida. It gets hairy late in their season, but early on, I'm going to go with Blake Horvath to try to make me some money in the first 6 weeks of the season. Who are you going with as the quarterback that you've seen enough from him to know that he's going to deliver every single weekend?
Steady as they come by MAC standards, Tucker Gleason for Toledo. Guy was able to amass 2,800 passing yards with 24 touchdowns and 8 interceptions last season. He's more mobile than you might think, chipping in 364 yards on the ground and 7 touchdowns. He's rarely asked to do too much in the Toledo offense. Toledo has really been a point of consistency offensively under Jason Candle, and they lean into the run game. They have a veteran O-line this year, and they'll continue to run the football. We're not going to see the eye-popping stats from him, and maybe not even the highlight athleticism plays, but he's a guy who makes the right read. He's very smart with the football. He rarely makes critical mistakes that cost his team the game, and he does well on the move. He can make accurate throws when he has to get flushed. So, as far as MAC standards are concerned, complete steady Eddie, Tucker Gleason.
I'm going to close out with my breakout star, and this is what I've hemmed and hawed. I've gone back and forth. There was a lot of really good options. There's the quarterback room at North Texas, I think, is really interesting. But I'm going to stay in the Sun Belt. I'm going to go with Walker Howard at Louisiana. Michael DeSormo returns as the head coach, along with his coordinators. The same exact staff turned Ben Woolridge into a star last year. And Walker Howard is an absolute blue chip recruit. And it's just it's almost a Rorschach test of how do you look at it. Did he not break through at LSU and Ole Miss because he didn't have that dog in him? He wasn't the kind of, guy to command a quarterback room and to, lead a program. Or did he just get stuck behind some really good quarterbacks? Because let's look at it. He had to play behind Jane Daniels and Nussmeier. I'm not going to blame the kid for not getting on the field at LSU. And in the last 2 years, he sat behind a first-round NFL draft pick in Jackson Dart. This is the same guy who was the nation's #1 dual threat quarterback by ESPN and listed number 5 by 24/7 Sports. Not in Louisiana, in the entire country. So now he comes in, he's going to offer more in the run game than they had out of the quarterback position last year. The only question is, will there be receivers to help him pop on the perimeter? And very quickly, you look at the top of their transfer portal class, Shelton Sampson Jr., a former 4-star, big kid, crazy speed out of the SEC. I could see him coming in and taking over. I could see the numbers that made their quarterback the Sun Belt Player of the Year last year transferring over, and let's put another 10 to 15% on Walker Howard this year. 2 layups to start the season as well, get that confidence up. Rice, they're going to be so dynamic offensively and difficult to prepare for, but defensively, there's nowhere to hide for the Owls. And then they get McNeese, an in-state FCS opponent. So I think it's going to give him some time to settle in, to get a feel for leading a program. And how rare is it in this, portal era where everybody is getting plucked from the G5 level and moving up to be contributors at the Power 4 level? It's been more and more rare to see these Power 4 guys drop down and try to resuscitate their careers. I think he could do it. And I'm basically going to give him the benefit of the doubt. You weren't going to play over the Heisman Trophy winner at LSU, and you weren't going to play over Jackson Dart. That doesn't mean you can't ball out. I think he's going to do it this year for the Raging Cajuns.
Hard to argue with that. I like it. Yeah, I went Maverick MacGyver. Now, where have we seen this before? We've seen a rock-solid FCS quarterback who puts up gaudy numbers in a pass-happy offense, who transfers to the FBS ranks, with his OC and some of the receivers that he worked with. Well, we saw it right here at Western Kentucky with Bailey Zappi. Well, this could certainly be another Zappi situation, as Maverick obviously comes in from Abilene Christian, where he threw for over 8,000 yards and 63 touchdowns over 3 seasons with the Wildcats. They're making the jump up with Western Kentucky, and they're bringing over the crew that Abilene Christian had success with over the last 3 seasons. We saw it in the FCS playoffs. There were so many flashes of brilliance with Maverick. When you look at the schedule for Western Kentucky, I think this is one that necessitates a lot of pass yards and some exceptional stats here. Sam Houston State's defense is going to be way down. North Alabama's secondary is weak. Nevada's secondary is really bad. Florida International, New Mexico State, Missouri State, all with descending or very poor defensive secondaries. And that is exactly what we are going to see as Western Kentucky's pass-happy attack take advantage of this. I look for MacGyver to have a very, very strong Conference USA show.
You know what I want to see in the bowl game? I want to see Western Kentucky against Troy. Do you know why that is, Duck?
I do. Because you want to see Goose and Maverick.
I
do too. It's a shame they won't play in this season. Talk to me, Goose.
I need to see the marketing folks, the brain trust behind the the Pop-Tart Bowl get their hands on a Maverick Top Gun related marketing campaign. So it's going to take a little bit from Troy. I'm with you on Western Kentucky. I think this offense could pop. It's a familiar strategy to go ahead and take a quarterback that's comfortable with a play caller and put them together and just basically swap them out, move them up to the FBS level. I hope this works. I hope our breakout stars make us look smart in, the coming months. And if not, how often are people listening back to preseason content, by the time we get to October, November? That's going to do it for Duck and myself. This has been the Group of 5 Deep Dive under the Big Bets on Campus podcast umbrella. There's a lot more coming down the pipe here in terms of what we have cooking up. We appreciate you tuning in. What you can do for us, before I get into some programming notes, you can go ahead and throw us those 5-star reviews. I'm happy to throw out some free bets and some parlays and some futures tickets throughout the season for anyone who drops us a 5-star review and a note. Say whatever you want, throw it in there, whether it's on, on Apple, or if you want to go over to our YouTube channel as well, subscribe, comment. All these things help in terms of our overall visibility. And as I mentioned, we're getting closer to kickoff, which includes all of our conference previews, which are going to start in earnest on July 31st. So subscribe, rate, review, make sure that it's at the very top of your podcast feed. Thank you again for listening, and we'll catch you here next time at the Big Bets on Campus podcast.